for the time we didn't get on Thursday all Thursday to make up for the time we not got Tuesday, and we still
You Wednesday?
still like it. Because I didn't get like any chances to play with them on Tuesday because we were too busy that day. No, we'll be fine. Come on Thursday, we're fine. And then I was there, I was like, I'm gonna come for like 4 hours, and then they decided to take a nap. And when they woke up, they were much upset that I was playing little. So they were gonna play.
All right, let's get Isaiah back down here and let Mom know that we're starting Bible class.
I knew that better than Dad.
That was Dad.
No, it wasn't.
Yes, it was.
No, it wasn't. I left my coffee cup over here.
You were
Couldn't have
over
been-
here and you were drinking it.
Yeah, you
You
walked.
spilled coffee on my broccoli.
I'm pretty sure it wasn't me.
So rude.
I would never do that.
Coffee. My broccoli is coffee stains.
Your broccoli is sacred.
Sacred broccoli.
Extinction of meats. We did last time. I'm just gonna. I don't
I'm
know why
trying
I
to
thought
get
we
the
were gonna
coffee
get that
stain
much.
off of my paper.
So today we're just gonna do monastic vows. We're just gonna do Article
Like a little
27.
tiny short one.
Where is it's not tiny short, it's medium short. Medium long.
The 30-minute Bible class.
Medium long. Where is Isaiah?
He's doing something in the back.
In the bathroom. I'm gonna draw the Mandalorian, but I need an eraser because look, I made his head too fat. I have that problem every time. I always make their heads too big. He needs a thinner head, so I don't have an eraser at the moment. So I'm just gonna draw broccoli.
What broccoli?
I mean, he looks cool. He looks like Boba. Maybe I'll just say he's Boba. But that's not Boba's helmet, so that doesn't work. Pedro has a thin helmet. Not Pedro.
So that's the food.
What do you look for? That? You have a strange obsession with drawing broccoli.
I don't have a strange obsession with drawing broccoli.
Why are you drawing broccoli?
I just thought it would be. I mean, continuously, this is my first drawing of broccoli I've ever done.
Wait, you haven't finished it?
No, I just kind of sketched it out on Sunday. Now I'm working on it again today. That was
You were
the
working
plan.
on it before Sunday.
Nope, just on Sunday.
You were working on something else Sunday before having to do with broccoli.
No, it wasn't. I was drawing a vase of flowers. Or, yeah, a vase of flowers, and then I did this cross, which I have to add something to, and I haven't decided what I'm doing with that.
Okay.
I also need an eraser for this guy, because there's a lot of things I gotta erase out of here.
Okay.
But I like it a lot. I just want to build a nice pencil portfolio. Cute ones.
Okay.
And this is gonna look cool. Is there something you have against broccoli?
Yes.
Because I do. I don't like it. I'm gonna draw banana next.
Another fruit you hate.
It's not a fruit.
let's get started here.
It's raining.
Isaiah,
Come on.
sit. No, come on now. You've been messing around. Called you multiple times. All right, page 53, big book. Grab a book, Isaiah. You're not. Put the pencil down. Grab a book and sit down.
Is this a different version than yours?
No. Yeah, slightly.
Because mine's in 70.
Isaiah, they're right here.
Yeah, there's a whole pile right here.
Help him find his spot, please.
Here.
Sit in a chair. You're too distracted.
There
There you go. Okay. Article 27. Monastic vows. So, what are we actually talking about? Obviously, there are still monks and there are still monasteries today, and so in some ways, what the Augsburg Confession is responding to here is still a problem, but it's not a problem that we see, at least on the surface, in most of the Christian world, the Protestant world, or in the Lutheran world. At least it doesn't seem like it on the surface. But that's not exactly true, because even though we don't have monasteries, so to speak, the idea on which monasteries are built is absolutely still a problem. So the idea that the only way to be holy is to separate yourself from the world and not live actually in the world is actually an abuse of what we heard about in our sermon text today. That we're not to love the world, but we're to die to the world. But at the same time, we're not to leave the world. In fact, Paul speaks about how in the church we are to separate from error and from those who are teaching false doctrine, and have no fellowship with them. But not that we're to do that to, and also to those who are guilty of public sin, or the impenitent. But we're not to separate from the world, because otherwise, as he says, we'd have to leave the world entirely. Well, there's the first thing. The second is, why do we not leave the world? Because our calling as Christians, for every single one of us, is to actually be God's voice and hands and lips in the world. To love our neighbor where we are. And that means that every occupation that God has called, every lawful, good occupation that God calls us into, every vocation is the term that we often use, is holy in itself, and God works through it to love one another, to love mankind, to provide for our neighbor. And that's for everything. Whether you're a grocer, a teacher, a policeman, a soldier, everything in between. That is God providing daily bread for people. And so, in monasticism, it rejects both of these things. First, it elevates separation from the world as something that's holy in itself. And second, it denigrates the loving and serving our neighbor in our common occupations as something that is lower or less good, or an inferior type of good work to something that the monks did in the monasteries, who isolated themselves from their neighbor. And were not actually in the world loving and serving their neighbor, but had abandoned the world and were actually committing sins of omission by doing so. All right. So the ideas that led to monasticism or the abuses of monasticism may not be as prominent today as we would think, but they're still quite relevant. It will be easier to understand what we teach about monastic vows by considering the state of the monasteries and how many things were done every day contrary to canon law. In Augustine's time, they were free associations. In other words, seminaries or monasteries were in some ways more like seminaries. They were not something you entered into permanently. Now, you may be there a long time, and you may have been there for more than just, training. But the monasteries originally were never a matter of isolating yourself from people. It actually became a means to actually serve your neighbor and to exercise yourself in the Word of God continuously. And no particular merit was placed in them, as if there's a vow that you must take, and now you enter into a newer and more holy estate than the common person. That came later. Later, when discipline was corrupted, vows were added for the purpose of restoring discipline, as in a carefully planned prison. So, it was originally a free association in which you agreed to, work together, study God's Word, lead a holy life. But of course, we're all taught that anyone in a monastery is a sinner. That means that discipline was still necessary, and when problems arose, they thought they could solve the problems by making everybody take an oath instead to follow the rules, as if this was going to fix the problem. Gradually, many other regulations were added, besides vows. These binding rules were laid upon many before the lawful age, contrary to canon law. So as monasteries became more and more common, and of course we learned that often monasteries had become a means by which parents who could not afford to pay for their children necessarily would shove them off to the monastery. And then now these young children would be pushed into taking these vows to follow the rule of the order when they didn't even understand what the rule would mean for them when they reached adulthood. And so, to be pushed into or to take a vow when you do not even understand what the vow really means, of course, is bad. And to push vows upon young children like this was, of course, sinful. Many entered monastic life through ignorance. They were not able to judge their own strength, though they were old enough. They were trapped and compelled to remain, even though some could have been freed by the kind provision of canon law. So, if a vow is sinful, and it seems strange, but an example of a sinful vow is to vow not to sin. Why? Because it is a vow that is impossible to keep. It is a vow that you will in no way be able to avoid breaking. And so, the canon law recognized that, when we had these situations where someone had taken monastic vows, then they should be freed from those vows when they find later that they're not able to keep them. This was more the case in convents of women than of monks, although more consideration should have been shown to the weaker sex. In other words, the men were more likely to be freed from their vows than the women were in the convents.
Sound of music, though.
Yeah. This rigor displeased many good people before this time. Yeah, but Sound of Music was way after the Reformation, after many reforms had been put into place. And of course, that's a movie. This rigor displeased many good people before this time, who saw that young men and women were thrown into convents for a living. Again, what we're referring to here. They saw what unfortunate results came of this procedure, how it created scandals, and what snares were cast upon consciences. They were sad that the authority of canon law in so great a matter was utterly set aside, and despised. In addition to all these evil things, a view of vows was added that displeased even the more considerate monks. They taught that monastic vows were equal to baptism. So you have this idea arise that these monastic vow, or the concept of a monastic order or office, had been elevated to something that was above and beyond and greater than any institution that God had specifically made in the scriptures. They taught that a monastic life merited forgiveness of sins and justification before God. They even added that the monastic life not only merited righteousness before God, but even greater merit, since it was said that the monastic life not only kept God's basic law, but also the so-called evangelical counsels. So this is what I referred to earlier. They divided between the Ten Commandments, which they said, that's just a bare minimum, and that's just for common people. You need to do those at a bare minimum. But you're not a really holy person unless you do these evangelical counsels, these even greater works, things like chastity and celibacy and poverty and obedience, the vow of obedience and various things. So they made they made people believe that the profession of monasticism was far better than baptism, and that the monastic life was more meritorious than that of rulers, pastors, and others who serve in their calling according to God's commands without any man-made services. None of these things can be denied. This is all found in their own books about monasticism. How did all this come about in monasteries? Well, at one time they were schools of theology and other branches of learning, and they produced pastors and bishops for the benefits of the church. Now it is another thing. It is needless to go over what everyone knows. Before they came together for the sake of learning. Now they claim that monasticism is itself a lifestyle of its own, instituted to merit grace and righteousness. They even preach that it is a state of perfection. So remember, you have the system of the merit of the saints, in which the saints were not just keepers of the Ten Commandments, but they went above and beyond and did even more. And they had what they called works of supererogation. Works that went above and beyond what God's law required, that therefore gained you not only the forgiveness of your own sins, but you had so much merit left over that you could loan it out to other people. And all of this was like put into a bank, like the church supposedly had a treasury of the accumulated merits of the saints of all these ages that lived lives like these. Well, add monasticism to it. That's the idea there. They're sort of like merit factories. So they're in this merit factory producing excess merit that is then banked and sold to those who don't have enough merit. That's a very crass way of stating it, and no doubt a Catholic would object to stating it so crassly, but it is absolutely their theology. All right.
Which is just going back to the fact that they believed that righteousness is what saved you. So the more righteous works you did, like merit would grant you righteousness, which would get you into.
Well, they denied the distinction between the righteousness of God and the righteousness of works is the biggest problem.
Yes.
So because they had lost the very distinction that Paul makes in Romans between God's righteousness and the righteousness of the law, which is man's righteousness.
Yes.
Yep.
And your merit granted you righteousness.
Yep. All right. All right. First, concerning monks who marry, our teachers say that it is lawful for anyone who is not suited for the single life to enter into marriage. Monastic, so did I, yeah. Monastic vows cannot destroy what God has commanded and ordained. God's commandment is this: because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife. It is not just a command given by God. God has created and ordained marriage for those who are not given an exception to natural order by God's special work. We talked about this before, that the forbidding to marry is a doctrine of devils because God gives the ability to be celibate and chaste at the same time. What does that mean? Chaste means that you are pure in your sexual thoughts and actions, and it does not mean so that can be true. That is true also in somebody in marriage. So pure and holy in your sexual desires and actions. So you can be celibate, which simply means that you do not marry, and it's supposed to mean that you have no sexual relations at all, and yet be entirely unchaste at the same time because you are filled with lust. Your thoughts are unholy. Okay. And so God created and ordained marriage because that is the natural estate of man. And because of sin, it is not possible for most people to not marry and still be chaste. And because the gift of chastity and in celibacy is given to very few, to force someone into a celibate life who is not given the gift is essentially guaranteeing their sin. So, this is what is taught according to the text in Genesis 2:18. It is not good that the man should be alone. Therefore, those who obey this command and ordinance of God do not sin. What objection can be raised to this? Let people praise the obligation of a monastic vow as much as they want, but they will not be able to destroy God's commandment by means of a monastic vow. And so you notice here that it's not just that the evangelical councils, the works of supererogation, go above and beyond God's law. They're actually contradicting God's law. Because God has given marriage as something that is good for man, and now they are denying that it is good for man. And they deny it by saying that you are more holy if you don't marry, in and of itself. Now, what does Paul mean when he talks about if you have the gift, it's better not to marry? He's not that it, in and of itself, it makes you a more holy person. It's that if God has given you this special gift so that you can dedicate 100% of your time to his kingdom without at the same time being tempted to sin sexually, then that's great. But the benefit there is not a merit that you have because of it, but the way in which you're able to serve God more with your time and give more attention to his things. So, that's an important distinction. Okay. Where did we go here? All right. In fact, paragraph 24. If in fact an obligation to a monastic vow could never be changed for any reason, the Roman popes would never have granted exceptions to the vows. It's not lawful for someone to make an exception to what is truly from God. You can't make an exception to thou shalt not steal. Right? There's no exceptions to thou shalt not steal. The Ten Commandments have no exceptions. And so if they could make an exception to a monastic vow, what does that mean? Well, the monastic vows were below, not above, the Ten Commandments. The Roman pontiffs had wisely judged that mercy is to be observed in these monastic obligations. That's why we read that many times they made special arrangements and exceptions with monastic vows. There's a famous case of the king of Aragon, who was called back from the monastery. So he was the heir to the throne because he became the heir to the throne when the other heir died. And now Aragon had no king, but he had taken holy orders and he was a monk. Well, they released him from his vows so that he could go serve as king. In the second place, why do our adversaries exaggerate the obligation or effect of a vow when at the same time they do not have anything to say about the nature of the vow itself? A vow should be something that is possible. It should be a decision that is made freely after careful deliberation. We all know how possible perpetual chastity actually is in reality, and just how few people actually do take this vow freely and deliberately. Young women and men, before they are able to make their own decision about this, are persuaded and sometimes even forced to take the vow of chastity. When a child, when a boy or a girl has not reached the age of puberty, they do not understand what sexual desire and lust even is. It's a foreign concept to them, particularly when you're growing up in a society that doesn't bombard you with everything sexual from the time you're out of the womb. They have no concept of it at all, because they have no innate natural desire for these things when they're a child. And yet these children are then pushed into making these vows. Therefore, it is not fair to insist so rigorously on the obligation. Everyone knows that taking a vow that is not made freely and deliberately is against the very nature of a true vow. Most canonical laws overturn vows made before the age of 15. Before that age, a person does not seem able to make a wise judgment and to decide to make a lifelong commitment like this. There is another canon law that adds even more years to this limit, showing that the vow of chastity should not be made before the age of 18. So why would they have changed it? From 15 to 18, a boy or a girl knows very, very well what lust and desire and sexual desire is. But they have not lived long enough to understand that temptation never goes away. When you're young, you think that this is just part of puberty, and you think you're going to be able to overcome it. You don't understand that it would have to be a lifelong, perpetual, constant discipline of yourself. And so even when you know what it is, you do not understand your own ability to resist. So which of these two canon laws should we follow? Most people leaving the monastery have a valid excuse, since they took their vows before they were 15 or 18. The majority of monks and nuns made vows before they were adults. Finally, even though it might be possible to condemn a person who breaks a vow, it does not follow that it is right to dissolve such a person's marriage. Augustine denies that they ought to be dissolved. Augustine's authority should not be taken lightly, even though some wish to do so today. In other words, in some cases, vows were taken, and then through their vow, they divorced their wives. Although it appears that God's command about marriage delivers many from their vows, our teachers introduce another argument about vows to show that they are void. Okay, so first, there was something about how the vow was taken that made it invalid, because you didn't understand what was going on. So now we get to a second category of vows that are null and void. You cannot take a vow to sin. And you cannot take a vow that by itself denies Christ. Every service of God established and chosen by people to merit justification and grace without God's commandment is wicked. For Christ says in Matthew 15:9, "In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." Everywhere Paul teaches that righteousness is not to be sought in self-chosen practices and acts of worship devised by people. Righteousness comes by faith to those who believe that they are received into grace for Christ's sake. It is clear for all to see that the monks have taught that services made up by people make satisfaction for sins and merit grace and justification. What else is this than detracting from Christ's glory and hiding and denying the righteousness that comes through faith? Therefore it follows that monastic vows, which have been widely taken, are wicked services of God and consequently are void, are null. They're invalid vows. In fact, you need to repent of the vow. For a wicked vow taken against God's commandment is not valid. For as the canon says, no vow ought to bind people to wickedness. Paul says, you are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace. Therefore, anyone wanting to be justified by his vows makes Christ useless and falls from grace. Anyone who tries to connect justification to monastic vows bases his justification on his own works, which properly belong to Christ's glory. And so, here they're talking about monastic vows. Any similar vow anyone can take. People make foolish vows that they're going to swear to not to sin in some fashion. You're like someone takes, if a drunk takes a vow to never touch alcohol again. Having failed repeatedly, thinking that somehow his vow is going to keep him from failing again. That's a vow that's wicked, not because he's necessarily finding righteousness in his sobriety, but because he knows he can't keep it. But it's even worse when the vow is in itself something that you're trusting in to make you holy. So if in swearing not to commit a particular sin or to do a particular work, you think that in this vow, in doing that thing, you will be more righteous, that is a wicked vow. Because your righteousness comes only by faith. And therefore, that vow denies Christ's righteousness. It cannot be denied that the monks have taught that they were justified and merited forgiveness of sins by their vows and observances. And indeed, they invented greater absurdities, saying that they could give others a share in their works. So there's the merit factory. If anyone wanted to make more of this point, to make our opponents look even worse, even more things could be mentioned, things that even the monks are ashamed of now. On top of all this, the monks persuaded people that the services that they invented were a state of Christian perfection. What else is this other than assigning our justification to works? It is no light offense in the church to set before the people a service invented by people without God's commandment, and then to teach them that such service justifies. For the righteousness of faith, which ought to be the highest teaching in the church, is hidden when these, quote, wonderful and angelic forms of worship with their show of poverty, humility, and celibacy are put in front of people. So we need to guard our thoughts and the way that we think about our works and about sin, because we fall into the same type of thinking. Our righteousness is in Christ. How then do we set our hearts on the commandments of God? By setting them on Christ and finding the desire to please God in the love that Christ has shown for you by forgiving your sins. So that your motivation is entirely that of gratitude, thanksgiving, and a desire to love God for the love that He has given to you. That is a truly good work. You see, you don't have to take a vow to fall into this same sin, you see, because what I'm telling you, it's easy to say, but extremely difficult to follow in practice. Because you know full well how many times that you have it in your heart to give up some sin or to not do a thing, and you succeed at a particular time in doing good or not doing evil. But right there is the thought that this makes me more righteous, more holy. It's there. It's in all of you, all of us. And so we call it the opinion of the law. The Latin term is the opinio legis. And Luther says that you're never rid of this until you die. And why? Well, because your old man of sin is selfish and loves to take credit for everything that he does. Simple as that. Okay. And in the case of monasticism, It is the opinion of the law in a regimented fashion. That's what monasticism actually is. God's precepts and God's true service are hidden when people hear that only monks are in a state of perfection. True Christian perfection is to fear God from the heart, to have great faith, and to trust that for Christ's sake we have a God who has been reconciled. It means to ask for and expect from God his help in all things, and confident assurance that we are to live according to our calling in life, being diligent in outward works, serving in our calling. This is where true perfection and the true service of God is to be found. It does not consist in celibacy, or in begging, or in wearing degraded clothing. The people come up with all sorts of harmful opinions based on the false praise of monastic life. They hear celibacy praised without measure, and then they feel guilty because they're married. They hear that only beggars are perfect, and so when they keep their possessions and do business, they do it with guilty consciences. They hear that it's an even higher work, a gospel counsel to not seek revenge, and so some in private life are not afraid to take revenge, for they hear it is but a counsel and not a commandment. So it can go both ways. Others come to the conclusion that a Christian cannot rightly hold civil office or be a ruler without sin. There are on record examples of men who hid themselves in monasteries because they wanted to forsake marriage and participation in society. So if maybe they had a terrible wife or something, and they couldn't stand their wife, so that they decided they're going to run to a monastery and take a vow there instead. They called this fleeing from the world and said that they were seeking a kind of life that would be more pleasing to God, but of course that was sin. They did not realize that God ought to be served according to the commandments that he himself has given, not in commandments made up by people. Only a life that has God's commandment is good and perfect. It is necessary to teach the people about these things. And so, nothing that the Lutherans are saying in this article is new. There really was, this particular article, you would have been hard-pressed to find anybody that didn't know it was true, that truly disagreed with it, because, except for those, of course, that were making money off of the scheme. Their own theologians, for centuries, had been complaining about these very things. Before our times, Gerson rebukes the monk's error about perfection. He testifies that in his day it was a new saying that the monastic life is a state of perfection. So many wicked opinions are inherent in monastic vows, namely that they justify, that they cause Christian perfection, that they make it possible to keep the counsels and commandments, that their works over and above God's commandments. All these things are false and empty. And they make monastic vows null and void. In other words, the very thing so remember, if you've got merit factories, and merit factories are being used to produce a product that you can sell to people and bring in lots and lots and lots of money, enough to pay for St. Peter's Cathedral in the Vatican, then to call a monastic vow null and void in and of itself is a direct assault on your source of income. And so you can see the motivation behind these is not what began maybe as a matter of trying to instill better discipline, was corrupted by the flesh into a finance scheme. And now the vow became a means of coercing people into slavery of a type. Because you, by their labors, are financially benefiting without them receiving any benefit at all, really, in the end. Okay. That's this article. Next time we'll finish the Augsburg Confession with Article 28 on church authority.